Hey Sarah, Ariana said that she's running like 5 minutes behind.
Okay. All right.
Uh,
So it says it's recording.
uh, uh, Hi everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. I want to begin first tonight by just going over a few housekeeping things. So unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, Alan Johnson won't be joining us tonight. He sends his regards, and we definitely apologize for those of you who tuned in tonight to hear from him. But we definitely still plan to have a great speaking engagement with Corinna, and we look forward to speaking with her. So, yeah, we will drop his book in the chat for those of you who would like to support him and keep tabs on him. Um, but like I said, we still guarantee that this is going to be an exciting night. So, before we introduce Karina, we want to go over a few housekeeping things. So everyone will be muted and will remain muted throughout the program. We are also recording this tonight. So we plan to share this video with everyone by at least Monday, and then it'll be on all of our YouTube channels. So definitely stay tuned for that. We plan on sending an email to everyone once that we get that up and running. So definitely keep a lookout in your emails throughout the week. Um, so there will also be the runtime for this will be 1 hour approximately. Our discussion will close with a Q&A, so please drop your questions, your name, where you're tuning in from, if you're comfortable with that, in the chat throughout the show, and we'll select a few of your questions depending on how much time we have and how long this um, our speaking portion of this goes. Then we'll definitely get to your questions. Apologies in advance if we do not get to your questions. Very briefly, I just want to kind of preference our partners this evening. So I am here representing OTSE, Ohioans to Stop Executions. We have been around since 1988, working to repeal the death penalty in Ohio. And I'm thrilled to pass the mic to Sarah Kraft, who across the state lines there, who will introduce the Indiana Abolition Coalition and our speaker.
Thank you, Ty. Yeah, so my name is Sarah Kraft, and I'm the interim director of the Indiana Abolition Coalition. Like OTSE, we work to end the death penalty in Indiana and oppose all executions. And we're just so grateful to be able to welcome our speaker tonight. That's Corinna Barrett Lain, who is the S.D. Roberts and Sandra Moore Professor of Law at the University of Richmond School of Law. She's currently on a nationwide book tour promoting her recently published book, Secrets of the Killing State: The Untold Story of Lethal Injection. Uh, the book pulls back the curtain of secrecy, presenting a view of lethal injection that states have worked really hard to hide. The story of lethal injection is a story of state law breaking and cover ups, fake science and torturous drugs, gross incompetence by woefully inept executioners, and a stunning state indifference to the plight of the people who are executed. Um, my colleague Ariana is going to put the link to that book in the chat. I have my copy right here from the library, and it is available. Whoops, you can't see that. It is available in bookstores and in libraries, but also from the link that she's going to put in the chat. Um, as Ty mentioned, Alan Johnson had a family emergency and could not make it this evening, but I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce him anyway and encourage you all to seek out his writing. Alan is a former journalist who spent 44 years in the newspaper business, including 18 years reporting on capital punishment cases in Ohio with the Columbus Dispatch. He was a media witness in 21 executions and wrote about dozens of others. Near the end of his journalism career, he enrolled in theological seminary and began a soul searching reassessment of the idea of executions. It's out of this soul searching that he wrote both his dissertation called Discovering Forgiveness in Executing Justice Through Capital Punishment, as well as a book called Death and Forgiveness, My Capital Punishment Witness. And Ariane is going to put links to both of those in the chat as well. A little bit more table setting before we get started. I promise you'll hear more from Corinna than me going forward. But before we dive into some discussion with Corinna, I know we have people in the audience from Ohio, from Indiana, and also from places around the country. And for that reason, I want to give a little bit of context into the status of the death penalty in each of our states. Just last month in Indiana, the state executed Roy Ward. He was the third person to be executed in under a year. Before those 3 executions, Indiana had not executed anyone in over 15 years. And like our neighbors in Ohio, we have legislation in front of our General Assembly that would end the death penalty. And the Indiana Abolition Coalition will be working hard to get that bipartisan legislation passed. In Ohio, there's not been an execution since 2018, with the current governor, that's Governor DeWine, delaying more than 20 executions during his time in office. Governor DeWine's reasoning for these delays is that the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation cannot get access to lethal injection drugs without jeopardizing access to life-saving drugs from those same drug manufacturers. Ohio also has the distinction of at least 5 botched lethal injection executions between 2006 and 2018. And it's worth noting that Ohio lawmakers are attempting to add suffocation by nitrogen gas as an alternative method to execution. But at the same time, a large bipartisan coalition of lawmakers have thrown their support behind efforts to end the death penalty. Table setting over. Thank you, Corinna, again for joining us. My first question to you is about how you came to write about lethal injection. What led you to this research? I know there are scores of books about the death penalty, most of them on my shelf unread, but what led you to write this particular book? Oh, you're still muted.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay, hi. Thanks for having me on. What led me to this work? I am a death penalty researcher. I have been researching and writing about the death penalty for nearly 2 decades. And this project started with a research question. That's what I do. And the question was, everything else aside, with the death penalty, why are states so terrible at executions by lethal injection? You know, why am I seeing 3-hour long executions and 2-hour long executions and people waking up on the gurney and trying to get off the gurney in the middle of their execution and autopsies with 16 and 18 puncture wounds? And I just thought, you know, we know how to put down our beloved pets. We know how physician-assisted suicide works. We put people under anesthesia every day and cut open their chests. And so what is it about this that they're so bad at it? Now there's a whole faith personal story behind there too, and I've been able to share that with some folks in Ohio this week, but that's how it began.
Wonderful, wonderful. So in May, this last May, Indiana executed Benjamin Ritchie. His lawyers, who may be on the line here, but his lawyers who witnessed the execution say that it was botched. Indiana also had a notoriously botched execution by lethal injection in the mid-90s. And as I mentioned earlier, Ohio has the distinction of having had 5 botched lethal injections. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to call an execution botched? Like you talked a little bit about that just then, but can you go into a little bit more of what are gruesome details? And what is it that goes wrong in these situations? How does that happen? Like, what did you learn with that question?
Well, with the question, I have to tell you, if you're asking, why are executions botched, it took me an entire book to explain it. So it might take just a minute. But, I think your question, Sarah, is a really important one of starting with the, definitions. What are we talking about when we talk about a botched execution? And different people talk about that in different ways. And so I define it at the beginning of my book and the project. And what I say is, a botched execution is when an execution does not meet in some palpable, obvious way the expectations that the state set, right? So if the state says it's going to go like this, and then it doesn't in some obvious, palpable way, that is a botched execution. And I think it's important to talk about it in that way because one of the things I detail in the book is that a lot of prison personnel say a botched execution isn't. And literally they say, well, he died, didn't he? That was the purpose. The purpose was for us to kill him and he died. So therefore it's not botched. And I have a huge problem with that because that is not the expectation of the American public. That is not what people think of as a botched execution. I would say my definition is more what people think of. And I think the other thing that's important to recognize in that is that botched executions are literally the tip of the iceberg. They are the torturous deaths that we can see. But below the surface is this whole other, much larger set of torturous deaths that we cannot see. And so even as I define what I, use as the term botched execution, the problems that I detail here are much larger. The problem with lethal injection is much larger than botched executions, even if all you're talking about is pain and suffering and a torturous death. So, as for your second question, what is it? I mean, they can't get the medical professionals. They've got prison guards pushing the syringes. They can't get the drugs. That is a problem endemic to lethal injection. The drug manufacturers don't want to sell their drugs. They can't get access to the veins. This is a population that has notoriously weak veins. It is a geriatric population with a known very high incidence of poor health, often former IV drug users. So, just the mechanics of it. So they can't get the veins. Um, I mean, and the problems sort of go from there. And one of the things that's interesting about this is in 1890, when the states were looking for an alternative to hanging, there was a commission in New York that studied, what is the alternative? And they end up recommending the electric chair, which is a story all on its own. But importantly, in 1890, they considered and rejected what they called death by drugs, what we call today lethal injection. And the two reasons they said was number one, anatomical difficulties. They knew back in 1890, this is a terrible idea for that particular population, maybe for anybody, but certainly for that population. And the other reason was the sustained outrage of the medical profession. And it's like, here we are, over 100 years later. And it's like, yeah, they knew that a whole long time ago.
I want to ask you about one execution in particular. I I remember it. It feels like a bit of a turning point in this conversation, at least to me, and that's the execution in Ohio of Dennis McGuire. Um, the that execution was the first time that Ohio used a drug called midazolam, and I know you write about that in your book. Can you talk about sort of why some of us think of that execution in particular? What was it about that execution that sort of made it a touchstone in these conversations? And maybe also tell us a little bit about midazolam and the way that states have experimented with different different types of lethal injection, different ways of skinning the cat, so to speak, in terms of drugs and number of drugs.
Yeah, sure. And the thing about Dennis McGuire's execution is it was actually the first of three massively botched executions in 2014. And, so after him came Lockett. After that was the 2-hour execution, botched execution in Arizona. At the end of 2014, when papers were looking at the biggest stories of the year, botched executions was on the top 10 list. And it started with Dennis McGuire in Ohio. So, it marked this turning point where people really started paying attention. So midazolam, also known as Versed, that's what most people know it as. It was an experimental drug. Ohio was the first to use it with this other drug called hydromorphone. And they actually, Ohio's experimentation ended up taking down one of the state's, go-to experts, this anesthesiologist named Dershowitz. He was caught advising Ohio on this protocol, and later, he denied it, and then he gets caught, and then he says, "I will no longer advise any state. I will no longer be involved." But in any event, there were emails from him saying, "Oh yeah, this combination, they're going to be, they're going to be down." And in fact, what he said, and I'm quoting his email, is that the midazolam would work synergistically with the hydromorphone, creating this multiplier effect that would, quote, knock the patient out, stop his breathing, causing death within a few minutes. But the state had nothing to back up that claim. Those two drugs had never been used together. They had never been studied together. Nobody really knew. And so, McGuire, his attorneys very smartly challenged the protocol. And this is, in my mind, one of the problems with lethal injection. The court sees the evidence, and the court says, in its opinion, there's absolutely no question, and I'm quoting it, there's absolutely no question that Ohio's current protocol presents an experiment in lethal processes, right? Like the judge is like, who knows what's going to happen? But the burden is on the prisoners to show what's going to happen. And so the prisoner loses, and uh, the execution goes through. It's Ohio's longest, at that time at least, the longest execution in Ohio's history. Um, it is, I'm trying to remember exactly how long that was, and I don't remember off the top of my head how long. For some reason, I'm thinking it was 27 minutes. But in any event, media witnesses talked about, both of his fists were clenched. He was gasping through the glass wall. Towards the end, it faded into small puffs from his mouth like a fish on the shore puffing for one last gasp that would allow it to breathe. It was 26 minutes. Okay, so it's 26 minutes. It set a record. And one of the witnesses, one of the family members said that one of the prison guards looked over and mouthed, "I'm sorry," to the family. Um, but, we later, these emails came out that the state knew all of the risks. And in fact, one of those emails, uh, the prison official writing it said, "Well, what about this? I heard that he might hyperventilate with eyes still open," and wrote, "This scenario would create an appearance of least at suffering, which would upset witnesses and inspire litigation." Like, we know all these risks. He could die, which he did, this long, prolonged, terrible death. And what he's worried about is that this would upset witnesses and inspire litigation.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you for taking us through that. I want to ask one last question before I send things over to Ty. She's going to ask you a little bit more generally about the death penalty, less about lethal injection. But Can you talk, you have a whole chapter in your book on secrecy and how in many ways we don't know the real truth about what happens in execution chambers. Can you talk about how states have been able to shield us from the process?
Yeah. And it's not just that we don't have that information. States work very hard so that we will not have that information. And, because I'm here talking to you in the Indiana Coalition, it's worth mentioning that Indiana is the only state in the country that has conducted executions and not allowed media witnesses, not made space for media. I think there's one other state, maybe Wyoming, but it has, that claims this policy. But, no other state has dared to do that. And I know that that was litigated, and I know that the court said, well, we're not treating media witnesses any different than the public. The public can't just show up, and so media witnesses can't either. And I just have to tell you, I was speechless. I just thought, the whole point of the media is because the public can't come. So, the media is the public's eyes and ears. That's how we have accountability in the state's most powerful moment. When you stop and think about that, which I know both of you have and the people on this call have, but this is the state killing people on purpose with other people filing into a room to watch. And for that not to include the media because the public's there just makes absolutely no sense. But, and the danger of that is one of the most recent executions, as you mentioned. The lawyers came out and said, here's what was happening, here's what we saw. And the state came out and said, no, nothing unusual happened. It was just fine. Well, this is exactly why you need independent media witnesses so that we know what's happening. But not allowing witnesses is just one of many of the states, the things that the states do. And so I just, go through and talk about all of the things, whether it's lowering the blinds when something goes wrong. That's the most, in some ways, the most explicit one, because it's like, someone's turning purple, someone's gasping, someone's trying to get off the gurney. What is the result? What is the reaction, the response of the state to lower the blinds? You don't get to see what happens. That's astounding to me. Um, and then there's secrecy statutes, of course, and I always think of Missouri in this way, but it's not just Missouri. But after the revelations of this malpractice-ridden doctor, what was Missouri's response? The next year, Missouri's legislature passed a statute that said it is unlawful. It is unlawful to reveal the identity of a current or past executioner. And if you should do that, you're subject to treble punitive damages. Another state, I think it's Arkansas. I don't think it's Louisiana, but it's one of the two, passed a similar statute and said, we'll make a felon out of you if you should reveal an executioner. And by the way, we're redefining executioner to include drug suppliers. But
Right.
so it's this, we're going to do all of these super shady things that we could never defend. It is indefensible. And because we can't defend it, there's really only one thing left to do, and that's hide it. And so, it's not just secrecy statutes, it's what prison officials say
Mhm.
afterwards. And so,
Mhm.
I spend pages saying, all right, here's what the media said, here's what happened, here's what the son of the murder victim said happened.
Mhm.
And then they came out and was like, no, no, none of that happened. And so there's a variety of ways.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
point is all the same, which is to remove the state from accountability at its most powerful moment. And I think as a constitutional historian, what makes me so upset, I mean, all of it does, but, and then to tell me, well, people support the death penalty when you're doing all these things to hide what this what
What the
this
death
practice
penalty actually
really is.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
tells you a
Oh,
lot.
yeah, absolutely. Um, all right. Well, I'm going to pass things over to Ty with Ohioans to Stop Executions. Ty, I know you have a bunch of questions for Corinna as well.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to say really quick, guys, don't forget to put your questions in the chat for Karina because this section is going to kind of round out things and then we're going to get into our Q&A. So don't forget to do that. So my question is, many legislators frame capital punishment as justice for victims. How does
Mhm.
that framing shape public opinion and legal precedent? And what truth does that obscure as we're talking about secrecy and things like that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that because as I go into dialogue with people across the political spectrum, and I really do welcome death penalty supporters to talk to me, that's one of the main talking points that I hear. Well, this is justice for victims. And so I think it plays a very prominent role in death penalty support today. Whenever I see those executions in Alabama, I mean, Governor Ivey, she's always talking about the victims. I've seen that in Oklahoma as well. And so I think it plays a big part. It's absolutely not true. And I'm a former prosecutor, and so I think about victims a lot. Um, my specialty was child sexual assaults, and I worked very closely with victims. I have seen the deep destruction and devastation that violent crime does. So, my heart is so with the victims that I'm going to be writing a law review about why the death penalty is bad for victims and why they should get warnings at the capital indictment stage, because I'll tell you, victims are told this will bring you closure. And what if we were being honest, what that warning would say is, I know you've just lost the person most important to you in your life. I know you are devastated. It's the matriarch of your family, whatever, and they might have died of just a terrible, violent death. So, I know you just lost this person. Now we're going to take at least 2 decades of your life, and you will not move on. You will be stuck. You will be tethered to this person for the next 2, 3, 4 decades. Mississippi executed a guy this summer on death row for 50 years. You will not move on. You're going to know about every appeal. You're going to know about every time they go to the infirmary. Like your life will change and be in this holding pattern, and you will grow bitter. And by the way, chances are anywhere from 50% to 2/3. Oh my gosh. Indiana, at 70% of all death sentences are reversed on appeal. 70%. So it's like anywhere from, half to 2/3 to 70%, there's a chance, I would be telling them, that it'll be all for naught. That death sentence, you're not going to end up, it'll just be the time that they took from you. And if it should ever be the case that you see this execution, be prepared that that person is not the same person anymore 2 decades later, and that there's a very high chance that the guards will actually feel sorry for that person. And so when I think about those things, I think the death penalty is really good in two areas, neither of which is the victim. Number one, high at the political level, stands for law and order. Second, prosecutors. It's good for our career to get, to do a big death case. And they talk about sometimes, well, we need to threaten someone, we'll kill you if you don't plead guilty. I find that morally reprehensible, but like those are the things I see. So I think the death penalty is good at the very top for top political purposes, and for prosecutors, it is not good for victims. Oh, sorry, one more point. This is
No,
super
go ahead.
important. Okay, sorry. In my travels, I've actually met some victims' family members. And one of the things that I didn't think about that I do now, and I learned this from a woman in Tennessee whose son was murdered in her backyard. And, one of the things she talked about was when my son was murdered, she said, I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. I couldn't move. I was afraid I was going to lose my job. I was going to lose my house. I needed therapy. My kids needed therapy. I needed childcare. I had all of these intense needs. I'm in crisis. And I went to, the government, the Health and Human Services, and they said, we don't have money for that. We don't have money for that. And why don't we? Well, we're spending $24 million per execution. That's a stat from Florida. But, and so it's just really bad. And one of the things she said to me was, look, I don't know, here's what victims really need. We really need services, and this is a political distraction. And so I'm very protective of victims, and this is very upsetting to me. Hmm.
Absolutely. So last night I heard you speak about the new victims that death penalty creates through the prison guards and the correction officers. Basically, they're becoming murderers themselves, and there's no doctor or anything that are performing these very extensive executions. So can you speak about that a little bit, and just what have you found in your research about who this affects, not just the family members, but the people that are in the prisons that are witnessing this and having to perform this?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because that was another thing that I've been studying the death penalty for a really long time. And it wasn't until I started studying executions that I was like, oh my gosh, how was I not thinking about this? But what those prison guards say, and I just quote them, what they say is, by the time an execution warrant comes down, we've been living with this person for a couple decades. We know they're not the same person. We know they could be safely housed for the rest of their life. One of the guards says, actually, they're completely defenseless. He described them as defenseless as they come in. And they said, we've gotten to know them as human beings. And then an execution warrant comes down and we have to kill them. And you can't expect that there won't be an effect from that. And so, I document depression, divorce, suicidal thoughts, substance abuse, alcoholism, weight loss, weight gain, the whole thing. Even family members of executioners. There's one where the family member, it's a daughter, and she said, we never were close to our father. He was always distance. We always thought he suffered from depression. He just wasn't emotionally available ever. And then he died, and we found out he was the executioner. And so it's like there's these collateral consequences of these. And I have to say, that's like one end of the extreme. But I also quote, there's actually two executioners, one of whom his quote just haunts me. And he says, yeah, it was really hard at first. It was really traumatic, but now it ain't no different than getting a beer out of the fridge. And so I feel like I just want to say to executing states, explain to me which of these is okay with you. Tell me which of these is okay with you. Neither of these are defensible. And as you said, Ty, it's who are we creating? It's like we're killing someone who killed, presumably, if we got it right, um, but is no longer a killer. But then who are we creating when we ask someone to kill for their job? And over again, I mean, it's really funny. I hear these statements, and whether they're coming from the guards or, other people, what they say after someone is executed is there was no need to execute them. In any event, they failed. They failed. The person who committed those terrible crimes died inside a long time ago. The person you killed was one of the most beloved members of the prisons, of the prison community. And so that was a surprise to me. And it shouldn't have been, but But yeah, there, and it's not just the prison guards. And then think about it. Think about the media witnesses, who have to watch state killing for their job. Think about the prison chaplain. Think about the innocent family members who did nothing but are watching the state set a date and kill their family member on purpose. So, there's just all sorts of collateral consequences that thinking about executions, like when we think about the death penalty, I don't really think we think about executions. It's this idea. But when you think about it, and it's like, oh, brass tacks, that's executions. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is what the death penalty actually is. Now look at it and tell me you think this is okay. And so that's part of what I'm hoping to do with this project.
Absolutely. That was a fantastic answer. I heard you speak about it last night, so I want to bring it up now. Um, so after decades of inertia, what, in your opinion, so what would it actually take politically, culturally, or spiritually to end
Mm.
capital punishment for good? Now, I will say this can be your opinion, and you can come from a research standpoint, just from what you've seen researching states who have ended it and other things like that. So just feel free to pull from anywhere.
Okay, how much time do I have? No. I'll be brief, and if your listeners want to talk more about it, we can. I come from Virginia. That's my home state. And at the time Virginia abolished the death penalty, we were still the second most executing state in the country. I did the legal history piece on Virginia's abolition. We had the widest, the broadest death penalty statute in the country, broader than Texas. We had the most narrow appellate structure. It was like we were like the jaws of a whale that then, snapped shut. And per capita, we actually had more executions than even Texas. Everything's bigger than Texas. But, if you wonder, what is it that made Virginia the first Southern state to abolish the death penalty, the capital of the Confederacy? I'll tell you, it was no death sentences. We had no new death sentences for a decade. And I think if I'm correct, that's where Indiana at least is. What was your last death sentence? Maybe 2014, I think.
That sounds right. Yes.
Yeah. And, so I think I chalk that up to capital, really, really good capital defenders who have learned how to tell these people's story and explain who they are and why they do what they do. And it's not so that they can walk. It's not to excuse the conduct, but it is to say, these are not the worst of the worst. Understand where this person came from. They're not, this is not Hannibal Lecter. These are not the worst of the worst. And so I think that is part of it. But, even in that story, um, even in that story, you had activists that were on the ground for decades. And the Capitol defenders talked to me and said, we could see the juries softening. We could see it. The prosecutors weren't paying attention to it, but we were, and we saw it. So, I think no new death sentences for us. Because we were so good at executing, we had two people left on death row. The death penalty was, for all practical purposes, dead. We were just paying the millions for it. So I think that's one, it's a fiscal, political, socio-political explanation. I think the other one goes to faith. I will tell you, I'm a separatist. I'm a constitutional historian. I have written about the importance of the separation of church and state. And so, that is my scholarly bent. That having been said, it's here, and when I see governors, saying eye for an eye or this or that, or, waving the Bible and going to church on Sunday and then killing people on Tuesday, I have to speak out, and I have to speak out as a person of faith. And I will say, I've been sharing my personal testimony of the story behind the book. And I gave this in Birmingham, Alabama. And a woman came up to me afterwards and tearfully told me I was a prosecutor in Alabama. She was retired, but she said I was a prosecutor for over 20 years. And I never had a problem with the death penalty until right now. And I was like, don't you make me cry. But, I am seeing that all across the country. And it's not just, by the way, it's not just Christians. I mean, I did this podcast with a rabbi about life and about redemption and about the rabbinic texts, saying, let no man stand between another man and his redemption. And it got more than 22,000 views in the first 24 hours. So I think, this is another piece of it. I think is really as as we have seen um, people from the religious right or whatever come into power. One question is, do you believe? Do you believe? Hey, redemption people, I'm here to tell you it's real. So anyway, I think that and I think information every time. I mean, I see so many people, they're like, okay, but I don't want to spend my tax dollars, paying for this person to live out their days. And I'm like, oh, girl, let me just tell you, you're spending way more
I was
on
about
these
to say you're
people.
spending way more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Um, Thank you for your response. That's spot on. So we would like to get into the question portion from the audience. Thank you all for submitting your questions. We've picked a couple while we have 15 or so minutes left of this program. I wish we had more. It seems like it went by so quickly. But so the first question was, please give an example of a botched death happening beneath the surface.
yeah, sure. Um, well, I can give you a whole bunch of examples. One of the things, so in 2020, NPR reported the study of over 200 autopsies. And these were using all different protocols. And, uh, and what they found was that 84% of these autopsies were showing acute pulmonary edema. So, pulmonary edema is fluid seeping into the lungs. I've come to learn it's not that uncommon. You can get this. Acute pulmonary edema is when fluid seeps into the lungs in seconds and minutes rather than days and weeks and months. And what medical experts have said is it is the sensation of drowning within. A court in Ohio said, "Is that waterboarding?" and the expert said, "Yeah, it's the same sensation. You are drowning within and not being able to do anything about it." And so I'm like, give me an example. How about 84% of these people, they're under a paralytic. It looks like it went just fine. We were waterboarding them to death. And there are some even without the paralytic, actually. So the Trump 2020 executions were with a single shot of pentobarbital. We know that pentobarbital, that also causes acute pulmonary edema. They were not with a paralytic, but as the experts have said, when you are hit with like, what will feel like 1,000 pounds of a barbiturate, it's like having 1,000 pounds on you. You really can't move. And so there were some of those executions where the executioners said, we just heard a little snoring. And the government, by the way, turned off the sound. There's another secrecy way. They give their final statement and then they turn off the sound. There's no reason to turn off the sound, but yet they do. And the autopsy showed acute pulmonary edema. Here's one more I'll just throw out, and then I'm sure there'll be other questions. But one of the things I've seen, whether it's with a paralytic or not, is Anesthesiologists have come in and said, listen, when you are being paralyzed, and even if there's a one drug pentobarbital, a barbiturate, like what we have in Tennessee, it's gonna feel it's gonna be hard. It works kind of like a paralytic knot, but you will feel this weight. You're not gonna be able to move because you've got this huge barbiturate on you. You're being drugged to oblivion. And what they said was, if you were really struggling underneath that, or if you're really struggling as the paralytic takes effect, look at the fingers. Look for movement in the fingers, because the fingers is actually this place where we have the most motor control. So it's the last thing that you lose. What have states started doing? As soon as the anesthesiologist started talking about it, states are now taping down their fingers. Taping down their fingers. And listen, they're already in restraints. There is no reason whatsoever to tape down their fingers other than it's a torturous death and you don't want any signs of it. So, I hope that that is helpful.
Yes, absolutely. That is insane to me. Absolutely insane.
Yeah.
One of you spoke about this last night, but someone had this question. Can you speak about the disproportionate percentage of minorities, especially African Americans,
Mm.
um, on
Mhm.
death penalty and like how this affects them the most?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things to understand, and I mapped this out in my legal history of Virginia's abolition, is, the death penalty is a cousin of lynching, of non-judicial hangings and beatings to death. And back in the day, there were actually these things that we call black codes. That's the actual name for them. And so these are statutes in the South that said, and they were, there's a whole set of them, but they basically said, here's just an example of one. Um, any crime for which a white person would receive 5 years of hard labor or incarceration is a death crime, is a capital crime if committed by a black person. Like it was literally in the codes. We're going to treat you differently based on the color of your skin. And so, one of the things that Justice Marshall talked about in some of these decisions was you can't just look at today's death penalty. Like it didn't just like come down like manna from heaven. It came from something and it bears the marks of that thing. But all of that, so all of that even aside, there was a challenge under the Equal Protection, well, under the Eighth Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. This is the McCleskey decision. I think it was 84, it might have been 86, but it goes up to the Supreme Court. And it was based on this study of Georgia called the Balda study. And what this study showed, and I think one thing I need to explain is that most violent crime, including most murder, is intra-racial. It's white on white, it's black on black. And so the places that you see it is when it's interracial. And when you have interracial crimes, what the Balda study showed is that even after taking into account 39 non-racial variables, so look, everything they could think of, there's nothing left but race. A black man killing a white person, a black person killing a white person was slightly more than 4 times more likely to receive the death penalty than a white person killing a black person. And again, there's nothing left but race, nothing left. And, so there's studies talking about that, talking about the incidence of the death penalty on people from Black and Brown communities. One of the things that I think people don't necessarily think about or know about is not just like whose life are we going to take, but whose life are we going to vindicate? And the answer to that is white lives, and primarily white prominent lives. And, so I talked last night about a study that I pulled from Louisiana, and it showed from the modern era, 1976 to 2016. So this was in a 40-year period of time. There were just over 13,000 Black men that were murdered in Louisiana. 40 years, 13,000. And, most of those are going to be capital eligible just because of the way the statutes work. So, around 13,000 is your choice. How many people were executed for murdering those 13,000 Black men? The answer was three. And when I was talking about this in Louisiana, I was like, I'm not sure what the statute, what the number is now. And I was in Louisiana with a litigator, and she said it's now four. I'm like, wow, you know. And so, and I think the other thing that is worth mentioning is in this case, McCleskey, the prisoners lose. The Supreme Court rules that it's not enough to show that race, played a part statistically speaking. You have to show that race played a part in your case, that the prosecutor went after you because you were Black. Okay. Which I'm like, nobody's gonna, like, who's gonna do that? Who's gonna find that? Right. But the court says in McCleskey, if states want to protect more, they certainly can. We're not going to recognize that under the Eighth Amendment, but like, go for it. And so North Carolina passes a Racial Justice Act. And North Carolina statute says if you can prove by preponderance, if you can show that race played a part in your death sentence, we'll overturn your death sentence. Now you're going to get commuted to life, but like we're not going to kill you if race played a part. The first three people to make a claim won. And they won overwhelmingly. And the judge is issuing this like I'm trying to remember if it was more than 100 or if it's more than 200 pages, but it was this massive opinion. And the judge said it's indisputable that race played a part in these decisions. We've got all white juries, all kinds of things happening. And so those three sentences get commuted. What does North Carolina do the next year? The legislature repeals the Racial Justice Act. And not only do they repeal it, but they try to make it retroactive to put back these death sentences. So one of the reasons why we haven't seen executions in North Carolina is because we've got all this litigation. And finally, the North Carolina Supreme Court said, that's an ex post facto law. You can't put the death sentence back on them after they've been commuted to life. But, I think that this speaks to the central issue of think about what that says. North Carolina was like, no, we need race. And I think when they were repealing it, there was a witness, I think a prosecutor, who said, listen, you're going to wipe out death row. I just thought, what? Right? He said the quiet part out loud. We need race to make this death penalty thing work. And as I said last night, I don't think it's necessarily that the death penalty has a race problem. I think America has a race problem, and it plays out, especially in the death penalty.
Absolutely. Thank you for your thoughtful answers, and thank you everyone for your questions. So before we close out, I'd like to invite you just to share one thought or takeaway that you would like the audience to carry forward, something that reflects your hope or warning or where this conversation should go next.
I'm going to leave with hope. I love hope. And one thing I would say, it is definitely not a time to be complacent, but I don't need to tell this group that. But on the hope score, what I can tell you is the death penalty is dying. The death penalty is dying. And there's two really big indicators of that. It's death sentences and support for the death penalty. So if you look at death sentences, I hear a lot of chatter right now because executions are on steroids. Florida's going absolutely nuts with its executions. And of course, Trump is like, kill everybody. But, and so people are like, I mean, I've had the question from media, oh, America is embracing the death penalty. Oh, America is using the death penalty. The death penalty is back. And I'm like, no, actually, executions mark a moment in time. It is an absolute time slice because the people that are there that have finished with their appeals, I mean, I hate to say it, but they're sitting ducks. They're there, and where there's political inclination, as there is in this moment, for cruelty, brutality, vengeance, they're the ones, that's going to happen. So it marks this moment of vengeance. But if you want to know what's going to happen with the death penalty, if you want to know where it's going, if you want to think about the future, you've got to look at death sentences. Today's death sentences are tomorrow's executions. Without death sentences feeding the machinery of death, the death penalty will die on the vine. That's Virginia's story, okay? And death sentencing over the past 2 decades is down a little over 80%. So the last year that we have data available is 2024, and there were 26 new death sentences nationwide, 26. Go back 2 decades to 2004, 125. So 125 new death sentences. That'll keep the death penalty going to 26. And even this year, in this moment of brutality, death sentencing is down. I'm watching it. I think in July, the number was 10. I think right now we have 16 or 17. Last year we had 25. I'm like, I'll be surprised if we get to 20. So even in this moment in time, and I think that's happening for reasons that an executive order cannot fix. People don't trust the death penalty. And for good reason. I was talking last night about, all right, in the modern era, we've had a little over 1,600 executions. I don't know, 1630, 1635, something like that. And we've had in that same time a little over 200 exonerations from death row, 201, 202, something like that. So when you put that together, for every 8 executions, there is one person where we admit we got it wrong. 8 to 1. That is a crap number by any measure. So, people know that. They know about racism. They know about actual innocence. They're hearing about prosecutorial misconduct. And I gotta say, I've had people ask me, okay, but what about Trump? And what I say is Trump is reason 1,270 to get rid of the death penalty. Look, Europe doesn't have the death penalty because they said, oh, it's a really bad idea to put the power to kill in the state. Look what happened to us. When you have bloodthirsty leaders, like you don't want them to have the death penalty. And now we're in this moment where Trump is saying, I am your retribution. And I'm like, that's yet another reason not to have this death penalty. So I think, the death penalty is dying for reasons that an executive order can't fix. And the last thing I'll say, because I know we're running short on time, is death penalty support. I hear from death penalty supporters, well, the people support it, and we're a democracy. And I do take issue with that, with the premise, because one of the things I say is lethal injection works very, very, very hard. They're spending millions of dollars to make the death penalty look like something else.
Mm.
So it must matter because they're pushing a rock of Sisyphus uphill that makes no sense. If not, oh man, we this has got to be people falling asleep. Out of sight, out of mind. I think the lethal injection is doing tremendous work. And so I really bristle at this notion of, the people support it when the state is doing all it can to make it look like something else because they know the people wouldn't support it. But that having been said, Gallup checks death penalty support every fall. And even last fall, death penalty support, straight up or down, do you support the death penalty? 53%. I'm like, and that was a 50-year low. I'm like, so it's barely, and that's not even, what happens when you say, okay, what about with life without parole as an alternative, which is true in every death state. So that's actually the more accurate question. And then it's the high 30s, low 40s. But even that up or down question, it's 53%. And then if you ask millennials, that slice, it's 47%. And if you ask the Gen Z slice, it's 42%. So the death penalty is dying. That's my good news. And it is definitely not time to be complacent. Um, I think, I think part of the Trump executions are to try to normalize death penalty and get those sentences up again. I think it's make the death penalty great again. So it's not time to be complacent, but it is dying. They know it's dying. And so this is the time to strike. This is the time to organize. This is the time to continue to have those public information campaigns that will soften jury verdicts. So I just, I'm going to end by just saying I'm so thankful for the work of both of your coalitions. And by the way, Sarah Kraft, your governor, Governor Braun, I heard him, I was looking and he said, you know, because they spent $900,000 on drugs that ended up being used for one execution. But he said, I'm going to listen to the legislature and I'm going to listen to the larger conversation. And people are saying, I wonder if the death penalty is still relevant. And so I'm like, he's putting it out there, y'all. Bring him a bill. And I certainly feel DeWine has done everything he can that he would sign a bill too. So, I think I just want to encourage you for the work that you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you. Leaving us on that hopeful note. I want to close us out by just reminding folks about the books that are available. We'll put those back in the chat so that you guys can see them. Corinna's book and Alan's book. As I mentioned, Corinna's on this whirlwind tour. Corinna, what's next? What's your next stop?
I am in Tennessee. We left Ohio and went to Tennessee. So it is Knoxville, Chattanooga, Nashville, Memphis,
All
Little
right.
Rock,
Wow.
Little Rock, and then Oklahoma City. So I end this tour in Oklahoma City. At the time, I thought I wanted to end either in Oklahoma City or in Texas. I wanted to end in the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
Now I'm like, I don't know, maybe I should have gone to Florida. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure. But I do want to say a word to go up for Bernice Johnson, who was 98 years old. And so, for all of you who are the praying type, I send my best wishes to Alan Johnson, who would have made this a really, wonderful conversation. But
yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Two more things. We're going to put the OTSE and the Indiana Abolition Coalition link in the chat. Make sure you guys are signed up to hear from us and to hear about upcoming events. You can see those events on those websites. There's also a lot of great communications coming out in the next several months from both organizations. And we have legislative sessions to look forward to in Indiana and to keep working on in Ohio. So thank you guys all for being here. Again, we're going to send out the video in case you missed part of it or in case you want to watch it again or share it with your friends. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
if you're in Tennessee or Arkansas or Oklahoma, come on. There's more conversations to be had.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.